I spent years studying the body language of strangers in coffee shops. It ended up saving a child. The little girl didn't look right. That was the first thing I noticed. Not the man sitting across from her, not the untouched hot chocolate going cold on the table, not even the fact that it was a Wednesday morning in October and she should have been in school. It was her body that told me something was catastrophically wrong. She was sitting completely still in a way that children never sit completely still. Not the stillness of a kid absorbed in a tablet or a book, but the particular frozen quality of a small animal that has learned through terrible experience that movement draws attention. Her shoulders were pulled inward, her chin was angled slightly down, and her eyes kept tracking to the door in a specific pattern. Measuring. Wanted calculating, not daydreaming. I'd spent 6 years sitting in coffee shops studying exactly these kinds of micro-expressions and postural signals for reasons that everyone in my life considered somewhere between eccentric and diagnosable. And in those 6 years, I had never once seen a child sit like that unless something was deeply, fundamentally wrong with her situation. My coffee cup was halfway to my mouth when I set it back down on the table. My notebook was open in front of me, filled with the morning's observations. And I had maybe 30 seconds to decide whether I was going to do something or whether I was going to talk myself out of it the way I'd talked myself out of so many things in my life that turned out to matter. My name is Garrett Osei, and I need to explain the 6 years before that morning to make any of this make sense. I was 34 years old, working as a freelance UX researcher for tech companies, which is a job that sounds impressive until you explain what it actually involves. Sitting and watching people interact with software, cataloging their frustrations, mapping the gap between what they say they do and what they actually do. The core skill of UX research is observation, not just looking, but genuinely seeing. Reading the micro signals that people's bodies send out before their conscious minds have processed the information, the flinch before the complaint, the hesitation before the click, the slight lean back that means a user has lost trust in an interface. I'd been good at the work for years before I started applying the same observational lens to the world outside of formal research sessions, which is a habit that sounds philosophical, but is actually just what happens when you train your brain to notice things and then can't turn that training off. The coffee shop obsession started in 2017, after my divorce from my wife, Priya, who left for reasons that were complicated and fair and that I'm not going to relitigate here. The short version is that I'd been so focused on observing other people professionally that I'd somehow managed to entirely miss what was happening in my own marriage until it was over. My therapist at the time, Dr. Annalise Foreman, suggested that I was using professional observation as a way of avoiding personal vulnerability, which seemed both accurate and useless as a diagnosis. What was I supposed to do? Stop noticing things? So instead of stopping, I started going to coffee shops every morning and doing something that I half-jokingly started calling field observation, just sitting with my notebook and documenting what I saw. Not in a predatory or voyeuristic way. I wasn't eavesdropping on conversations or photographing people. I was watching how people moved through space, how they held their bodies, how their posture shifted when someone they were with said something unexpected. It started as a way of processing grief and turned into a practice I couldn't imagine giving up. I filled 17 notebooks over 6 years. My current girlfriend, Ren Nakamura, calls it my coffee shop habit with a tone that's affectionate but also slightly worried, like she's waiting for me to develop a more normal hobby. I've tried explaining that it's basically the same skill I use professionally and that it's made me significantly better at my job, at understanding people, at reading rooms and situations. She accepts this explanation without fully believing it, which is fair because even I occasionally wonder if I've turned a coping mechanism into something I've confused with a personality. The coffee shop where I saw the girl was a place called Elm and Ground on Bancroft Avenue in Berkeley, California, which I'd been going to for about 2 years at that point. It was a Wednesday in October, around 9:15 in the morning. The place was moderately busy with the usual post-rush crowd, remote workers settling in for the day, a few students, as a retired couple who came in every morning and always sat at the same window table. I knew the regulars well enough to nod to them without knowing their names, which was the kind of relationship I'd cultivated across 3 or 4 coffee shops in my rotation. The man with the girl was not a regular. I'd have noticed him before. because he was the kind of person who generates mild low-level unease in a room without doing anything you could specifically point to. He was somewhere in his mid-40s, heavy-set, with the kind of careful neatness about his appearance that reads as deliberate performance rather than natural habit. The pressed collar, the precisely combed hair, the way he'd positioned himself at the table with his back to the wall, and a clear sightline to the exit. He was smiling at the girl. And the smile was technically correct in all its components, but had the same quality as a locked door wearing a welcome mat. The girl looked about 8 years old. Dark hair pulled back in a ponytail that was coming loose, a purple jacket that was slightly too big, and those eyes that kept going to the door. I wrote in my notebook, "Man performing calm. Child suppressing distress response. Relational dynamic unclear. Does not read as father/daughter comfort baseline." Then I closed my notebook and looked more carefully, because something in my chest had already decided this wasn't just an interesting behavioral observation. I want to describe what I saw precisely, because the precision matters. When a child is with a trusted adult, a parent, a grandparent, a teacher, anyone they've built genuine safety with, there's a kind of unconscious physical orientation toward that person. Kids lean, they touch, they check in with their eyes in a casual, reflexive way that's about comfort and connection. Even a child who is bored or tired or in trouble will still have that baseline orientation toward their safe person. This girl had none of it. She was not oriented toward the man at all. She was oriented away from him, in the particular pulled inward way of someone who has learned that taking up space is dangerous. She held her hands in her lap with her fingers laced together, and every few minutes the man would say something, and she would nod without lifting her eyes, and then go back to watching the door. What she looked like, I realized, was a child who was doing exactly what she'd been told to do and was terrified of doing it wrong. That's a specific behavioral profile, and it's not the same as a shy kid or a tired kid or a kid who'd rather be somewhere else. It's the profile of a child performing compliance under threat. I'd seen adults perform compliance under threat in research sessions when they were trying not to disappoint a supervisor who'd asked them to test a product they clearly hated. I'd never seen it in a child in a coffee shop before, and the fact that I was seeing it now made my hands feel strange and cold around my coffee cup. I pulled out my phone and opened my notes app. I typed, child approximately 8 years old, purple jacket, ponytail, with adult male, table 7, up at 9:18 a.m., Then I added, does not appear to be in safe situation. Then I sat very still and tried to decide what to do next, which is its own kind of problem when you've built your entire professional life around the idea that observation without action is a valid and complete form of engagement. The thing that stopped me from immediately going to the counter and asking the barista to call someone was the very real possibility that I was wrong. 6 years of notebooks and 17 volumes of behavioral observations don't make you infallible. They make you pattern recognizing in ways that are sometimes useful and sometimes just pareidolia. Seeing faces in clouds, seeing threats in benign interactions, projecting meaning onto behavior that doesn't have the meaning you're assigning to it. And the man could have been the girl's father or stepfather or uncle, and she could have been in trouble at school or scared about something completely unrelated to him. And what looked like threat response compliance could have been ordinary childhood shyness amplified by my own readiness to see it. I'd spent 6 years training myself to observe without projecting. And right now, I was violating my own methodology by layering interpretation onto incomplete data. So I decided to gather more data. I shifted my position slightly to improve my sightline, ordered a second coffee I didn't need, and watched. Over the next 12 minutes, 3 things happened that moved me from concern to certainty. The first was that the man reached across the table and put his hand over both of the girl's laced hands. And her entire body went fractionally more rigid in a way that was completely invisible unless you were looking for exactly that signal. It wasn't dramatic. There was no flinch, no pulling away. It was the microsecond increase in tension that you get when someone who has been holding very still manages to hold even stiller, which is a thing the body does when it's already at maximum tension and then gets more input it doesn't know how to process. The second thing was that when a woman at the next table dropped her bag and said, "Oh damn," loudly, the girl's head came up fast with this flash of hope in her face, real, unguarded, involuntary, before she controlled it back down. That flash lasted maybe a quarter second. I'd have missed it if I hadn't been watching her face specifically. But it told me something critical. She had been watching for an opportunity, and for 1/4 second she thought this might be it. The third thing was that the man checked his phone, then looked at the girl and said something in a low voice, and she nodded once in that performed compliance way. And then she slid her hand into her jacket pocket, and I saw her touch something there, just her fingertips moving under the fabric in a small, repetitive motion, like she was trying to reassure herself that whatever it was still there. I didn't know what she had in her pocket, but I knew that whatever it was the thing she was holding on to. I closed my notes app and stood up. Here is where I have to be honest about something uncomfortable, which is that standing up was harder than it should have been. Not because I was afraid of the man, though that was part of it, but because I was about to cross a line that I had always kept myself on the correct side of, which is the line between observing and intervening. In 6 years of field observation, I had noticed dozens of things that concerned me in various degrees, and I had done almost nothing about any of them. A couple who seemed to be having the kind of argument where someone was going to get hurt later. A man who kept following a woman around a cafe with attention she clearly didn't want. A teenager who sat for 3 hours not eating, not drinking, just staring at a blank phone screen with the particular hollow expression of someone in an acute depressive episode. I told myself in all of those situations that I didn't have enough information, that intervention was presumptuous, that I might be wrong. And maybe I was right some of those times. But sitting here 6 years later, I was willing to admit that some of those times I had been using "I might be wrong" as permission to not do something that was difficult. This time, I decided I would rather be wrong and embarrassed than right and inactive. I walked to the counter, leaned slightly across it, and said quietly to the barista, a young woman with a short purple streak in her hair whose name tag said Romy, that I was worried about a child in the cafe, and I wondered if she could call the police non-urgently to do a welfare check. Romy looked at me with the careful, neutral expression of someone who has worked in a customer-facing job long enough to have developed a professional poker face. She asked which table. I told her. She glanced across the shop in a way that was impressively subtle, then looked back at me and said in the same quiet register, "That man came in alone first. The girl came in about 4 minutes later. She sat down at his table, and he bought her the hot chocolate." I hadn't known that. The 4-minute gap between their arrivals changed the data considerably, and I could see from Romy's face that she'd also noticed something, had been watching them before I said anything. She reached for the phone under the counter. Officer Diana Kwan arrived 8 minutes later, and I want to say first that the way she handled the next 15 minutes was one of the most impressive things I've ever seen a person do professionally. She was a patrol officer, probably late 20s, small frame, and she walked into Elm and Ground looking like someone stopping in for a quick coffee before a shift. She didn't approach the table immediately. She went to the counter, ordered something, chatted with Romy for about 45 seconds while very clearly taking in the whole room. Then she walked to a table 2 spots away from the man and the girl and sat down facing them. She took out her phone. She did not look at them directly for the first 2 minutes, which I recognized as deliberate de-escalation strategy. Not telegraphing intent, not giving the man time to do something reactive. I'd moved back to my original table and had my notebook open and was writing everything I could observe with the urgent specificity of someone who understood that the next several minutes might need to be documented accurately. No, the girl noticed the officer almost immediately. I saw it happen. The slight lift of the chin, the eyes tracking the uniform, the fraction of tension in the girl's face that was different from the fear tension I'd been watching. It was something closer to calculation. This child was smart, and she was paying attention, and she was trying to figure out if this was something she could use. Officer Kwan, without looking at the girl at all, did something I noticed, but the man almost certainly didn't. She placed her right hand flat on the table, palm down for about 3 seconds, then removed it. It was a gesture that meant nothing contextually and everything directionally. The girl looked at that hand, and I watched her make a decision. She picked up her hot chocolate for the first time, looked at the man, and said something, and he nodded, and she stood up and walked toward the bathroom at the back of the cafe. The man watched her go with that carefully neutral expression. What he didn't see was Officer Kwan follow her, because she took a different angled path that kept him in her peripheral vision while moving parallel to the girl. I sat completely still at my table and tried to breathe. The man stayed at the table for 4 minutes after the girl went to the bathroom. I watched his performance of casual waiting slowly acquire edges, the slight jiggle of the knee that started around the 2-minute mark, the way he began checking his phone more frequently. The moment around minute 3, when the smile finally came off his face entirely, and he was just watching the bathroom door with flat, unreadable attention. At the 4-minute mark, he stood up. Deep before he'd taken a step, Officer Kwan was back in the cafe from a side entrance I hadn't noticed before, and she had her badge visible, and she was not alone. A second officer, male, significantly larger, had come through the main door. The man sat back down. It was not a choice so much as a physics problem. Romy had disappeared into the back, and I was the only customer still in the shop because at some point in the last few minutes, without any obvious signal, everyone else had quietly relocated outside. The next 30 minutes were a procedural blur from my vantage point. I was asked to stay and give a statement, which I did, typing notes into my phone simultaneously because I'd learned from professional practice that memory is degraded by stress, and contemporaneous documentation is always more reliable. What I could piece together from what Officer Kwan told me and what I later learned through other channels was this. The girl's name was Iris Valade. She was 8 years old. She had been missing from her home in Fremont since the previous Monday morning, which was 62 hours before I saw her in that cafe. Her parents, Odette and Remy Valade, had filed a missing persons report within hours of her disappearance. An Amber Alert had been issued, but the alert had been geolocated to the Fremont area, not Berkeley, which is why nobody in the cafe had immediately connected the girl to the alert. The man's name was Clifford Bray. He had a prior conviction for a lewd act involving a minor from 11 years ago that had resulted in probation rather than prison time due to what the court at the time had apparently considered mitigating circumstances. He had been registered as a sex offender in California for 9 years. He had removed his tracking monitor 4 days ago. In the bathroom of Elm and Ground with Officer Kwan, Iris had told them her real name and that the man had told her his name was her mother's cousin, that her parents had sent him to bring her somewhere safe, and that if she made any noise or tried to run, something bad would happen to her parents. She had believed him initially because he'd known details about her family that she hadn't known a stranger could know. She'd had her home address written on a folded piece of paper in her jacket pocket, which was what she'd been touching. She'd put it there herself before she left her house Monday morning, because she'd been nervous about a field trip and had worried she might get separated from her class and forget her address. It was the thing she'd been holding on to for 62 hours. I gave my statement to Officer Kwan and then to Detective Randall Osei, no relation to me, which we noted with a slightly uncomfortable acknowledgement that 2 black men with the same surname meeting under these circumstances was the kind of coincidence that generated questions neither of us particularly wanted to field, who arrived about 45 minutes after the initial response. Detective Osei was a 15-year veteran of the Berkeley PD with the particular economy of movement and expression that comes from spending over a decade processing situations that would constitute the worst day of most people's lives. He asked me to walk him through exactly what I'd observed and when, and I gave him the same account I'm giving here, including the specific behavioral indicators that had concerned me. He listened without interrupting, which was not the experience I had expected. And when I finished, he asked me to describe my professional background. I told him about the UX research work, about the 6 years of field observation, about the 17 notebooks. He looked at my notebook, which was sitting on the table between us, and asked if he could look at the entry I'd made that morning. I slid it to him. As he read the line about the man performing calm and the child suppressing distress response, and something in his face shifted, not visibly dramatic, but present. He said, "This kind of behavioral observation, is this something you do systematically, or was today circumstantial?" I said I tried to be systematic about it. He said, "I'd like you to write out a formal account of everything you observed this morning, as detailed as you can make it, including timestamps where you have them. It'll be part of the evidentiary record." I said I would. He handed me his card, stood up, and paused. "The fact that you said something," he said, "that matters. Most people who notice something like this talk themselves out of saying anything. He left before I could figure out what to say back to that. What followed over the next 2 weeks was a process that I experienced mostly from the outside, since I was a witness and a source rather than an investigator, which meant I received information in disconnected fragments and had to resist the UX researcher's habit of trying to map the complete system from partial inputs. What I learned came from Detective Osei, who called me twice with updates that felt like professional courtesy more than obligation, and from the news coverage that began about 18 hours after Iris was found. Clifford Bray was charged with kidnapping, false imprisonment, and multiple violations of his sex offender registration and monitoring conditions. The DA's office, specifically Deputy District Attorney Nkiruka Adeyemi, who was quoted in the initial reporting as having 15 years of experience in crimes against children, indicated that additional charges were being reviewed pending investigation into what Bray's devices and records contained. Adeyemi's office issued a statement saying that the swift identification of the situation had been critical to the outcome, and specifically cited the witness alert as the factor that had initiated the police response before Bray had moved the child to a secondary location from which, the subtext made clear, recovery would have been substantially less certain. I read that phrase, secondary location, and I sat with it for a long time in my apartment, because it was doing a lot of work as a piece of language. Containing within it several outcomes that I didn't want to think about concretely, but that I understood with a clarity that made me feel physically cold. Iris Valade had been in that cafe because Bray needed to maintain the fiction of normalcy. Public space, hot chocolate, the performance of a child out with an adult who had every right to have her. He'd intended to move her within hours. The cafe stop had been a practical pause, not a destination. What I'd seen in those 12 minutes of observation had been exactly as bad as it looked, and the badness of it didn't diminish just because the outcome had been survivable. Odette Valade called me 9 days after her daughter was found. She'd gotten my number from Detective Osei with my permission. Because I'd told him when he asked that I was willing to speak with the family if they wanted that. The call was brief, and I'm not going to recount most of it because some moments belong entirely to the people living them and not to anyone else's narrative. What I'll say is that she was a woman who had spent 62 hours on the worst side of a door that most parents can barely bring themselves to imagine standing near, and she had the voice of someone who was still processing what it meant to be on the other side of it. She thanked me, and I said the things people say in those moments that feel inadequate but are also the only things available. At the end of the call, she said, she still has the paper with her address written on it. She says she's keeping it. I didn't know what to say to that, so I said, good. After I hung up, I sat for about 20 minutes without doing anything, and then I opened my notebook to a new page and wrote the date at the top and sat there for another few minutes before I put the pen down and just let myself feel the weight of what had happened and what hadn't. Both the relief and the specific gravity of what the word almost contains. The coverage, when it came, was more extensive than I'd anticipated and considerably more uncomfortable. The local Berkeley News ran it first, then the Bay Area affiliates, and then it became the kind of story that aggregators pick up and distribute nationally because it has a shape that people find satisfying. The undervalued hobby that turned out to matter. The ordinary person who noticed the thing that needed to be noticed. The outcome that arrived just in time. I understand why it appeals. I understand the architecture of it, having spent 6 years observing how people respond to narratives that contain both threat and relief. But living inside the story, rather than observing it from the outside, was a different experience, less cleanly satisfying and more complicated. Several outlets describe me as a human lie detector, or a behavioral expert, which was flattering and inaccurate in ways that felt important to correct. Because the inaccuracy wasn't just about me. It was about what had actually happened and why it had worked. What I had was not a superpower. It was 6 years of paying attention in a structured and disciplined way, combined with the decision, in a specific moment, to act on what I'd noticed rather than rationalize it away. Both of those things were replicable by other people. However, neither of them required anything beyond the decision to take the practice of attention seriously and then to trust the conclusions that practice produced. I said versions of this in 3 different interviews before I stopped agreeing to interviews, because the story people wanted to tell was about the extraordinary individual, and the story that seemed true to me was about what becomes possible when ordinary people practice the skill of genuinely seeing each other. My girlfriend Ren, who is a structural engineer and has a deeply pragmatic relationship with evidence and outcome, read all the coverage without comment for several days. And then one evening, while we were eating dinner, she said, "All those mornings in coffee shops, I always thought you were just avoiding working." I said, "I was also doing that." She didn't say anything for a moment, and then she said, "I think I might have talked you out of going that morning. I almost called you to get breakfast together." I hadn't known that. She hadn't mentioned it before. We sat with that for a little while, the presence at the dinner table of a thing that hadn't happened and what it might have meant if it had. Ren is not a sentimental person, but she reached across the table and put her hand on mine in a way that meant something neither of us needed to put words to. I thought about Iris touching the folded paper in her pocket, the small thing that people hold on to when they need to remember that they have a place to go back to. My 17th notebook still had about a third of its pages empty when this happened, and for about 2 weeks afterward, I didn't open it. What the coffee shop felt different, and I needed some time before I could walk back into Elm and Ground and sit at a table and just observe the way people moved without carrying the weight of that particular October morning into every interaction. Romy, the barista, had been recognized separately in the coverage for her quick response, and when I finally went back in, she made my coffee without me ordering it and slid it across the counter and said, "On the house, always," in a tone that closed the subject and opened the next one simultaneously, which is a social skill I genuinely admire. Dr. Foreman, my therapist, asked me in our next session whether I'd processed the experience adequately, which is her way of asking if I'd let myself feel it or if I'd converted it immediately into an intellectual exercise and filed it away. I said I thought I was still processing it. She said that was appropriate. She also said something that I've been turning over since. She said that 6 years ago, when I started the coffee shop observations, she'd seen it as a symptom, a way of maintaining distance from real connection by staying in the role of the observer. She still thought that had been partially true at the start, but she said that what had happened in October suggested that the practice had evolved into something else, a form of presence rather than distance, a way of being genuinely attentive to the people around me rather than just cataloging them from behind glass. She asked if I agreed with that characterization. I said I wasn't sure, that the line between attentive presence and managed distance was one I still regularly confused in myself. She said that being able to articulate that confusion was itself evidence of something. I asked what? She said, "That you're actually in the room." I thought about a little girl in a purple jacket sitting at a coffee shop table, practicing the art of being invisible, holding her address in her pocket, like a compass pointing toward home. I thought about how you can practice the skill of paying attention until it becomes instinct, until it stops being a habit and starts being the way you move through the world, until the gap between seeing and acting becomes small enough that you don't have the option of choosing inaction anymore. I thought about what it costs to keep your eyes open in a world that offers you so many good reasons to look away. Yet the case against Clifford Bray proceeded through the legal system with the particular slow grind of institutional process. Deputy D.A. Adeyemi's office filed additional charges, including possession of prohibited material found on his devices, the specific nature of which the court documents described in terms I read once and declined to read again. His attorney, a man named Arthur Spice, who had the rumpled, overworked appearance of a public defender stretched across too many cases, entered a not guilty plea at arraignment, which is standard procedure, but the subsequent evidence review did what evidence does when it's thorough and unambiguous. At the preliminary hearing, Judge Constance Arriaga reviewed the prosecution's filing and denied bail on grounds of flight risk and danger to the community, citing the monitoring violation, with a prior conviction and the circumstances of Iris's detention. I was not present in the courtroom for any of this, but received summaries from Detective Osi, who seemed to consider me a minor stakeholder in the outcome worth keeping informed, which I appreciated more than I knew how to properly express. Bray eventually entered a guilty plea to the kidnapping charge and 3 additional counts in exchange for a sentencing agreement. He received 23 years. I read the sentencing report on a Monday morning sitting at my table at Elm and Ground, in the spot where I'd been sitting the October morning Iris Valad walked into her own rescue, and I finished reading it and closed my phone and picked up my notebook and wrote the date at the top of a new page. Then I wrote 9/21 AM Elm, and Ground. A man and a woman at table 4 having an argument they've both had before. You can tell by the economy of it. No wasted energy on new positions, just old ones worn smooth with use. They're holding hands while they argue. That part is new, or at least new enough that it still registers as data worth recording. I kept writing until my coffee was cold, and the morning light moved through the window the way morning light does in October, specific and golden and aware of its own brevity. And I thought about how the world is always showing you things if you choose to look, and how the choice to look is both smaller and larger than it sounds, and how sometimes it is everything.